Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well. So I'm really excited to be diving into today's video with you guys because this is a very interesting topic to me. This is a phenomenon that I've been noticing for the past few weeks, and I can't wait to really explore, how we got here, why is it that studios are moving in this way, and what are the consequences for these studios, for audiences, and also for creatives in Hollywood. Now, the phenomenon that I'm discussing today, as the title suggests, is the curious case of the disappearing streaming shows. This is a phenomenon that I have noticed pop up a lot in the trades. I've seen various reports of studios taking down their own original content that they pumped millions of dollars into in order to supplement their own streaming services. To me, this seems entirely counterintuitive, but of course, if we're digging into why studios are doing this, the fundamental reason is always going to be money. Okay, it's always going to be money some way, somehow, but I thought it'd be fun to dive into exactly why and how they're doing this nonetheless and get a longer answer to the question. So if all of this sounds good to you guys, then stay tuned and be sure to give this video a thumbs up if you enjoy this kind of content. And also, as per usual, if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to my channel and make sure you turn on your notifications so that you can be told when I upload next. It's Little Mermaid week. It's Little Mermaid week. Okay, oh my goodness, I'm counting down the days. Without further ado, guys, let's dive into this curious case of the missing streaming shows. So before we explore what's been going on for the last few months, I thought I'd do a quick little history lesson and rewind back in time to about 10 years ago when Netflix decided to produce its own original content for the very first time, and we got the likes of House of Cards and Orange is the New Black in 2013. Netflix became a streaming platform officially in about 2007, but initially their business plan was to license out content from existing Hollywood studios in order to supplement the streaming platform. And so that's how they were able to build their library, is by getting these licensing deals from the studios. And that meant paying large amounts of money up front and then being able to distribute that content for a certain period of time as per the contractual agreement. And so that's why in the early days, Netflix had a bunch of the classic favorite shows like The Office, Parks and Rec, Friends, Big Bang Theory, because they paid a ton of money for the licensing deals to allow them to air or distribute those shows for a certain period of time. After several years of Netflix being uncontested as the Coca-Cola of streaming, other studios started to sniff around and see if there was money to be made in these platforms for themselves. They kept asking themselves, hang on a minute, we have the content, okay? We are pumping out millions upon millions of dollars to create this content only to license it out to Netflix, and now Netflix is making a ton of money per month with this subscription model. Like, what? Isn't there a way for us to capitalize on this? Like, why are we exporting all of our goods when we could keep it for ourselves and create our own streaming platforms? Now, Netflix smelled the blood in the water. It saw the writing on the wall, okay? Because these are conversations that were being had about a decade ago, which is why in 2013, Netflix released its first original series in House of Cards and Orange is the New Black, because it wouldn't have to license out those shows because they were made in-house. And this turned out to be a very prudent move on Netflix's part, because sure enough, just a few years later, the other traditional Hollywood studios started to, take a page out of Netflix's book and created their own streaming platforms where they could air their own original content on. And thus the streaming wars began, where we saw traditional Hollywood fighting against Netflix, this child of Silicon Valley, recently. We saw Netflix produce a bunch of original content on its platform, so it wouldn't need to license out content from other studios. It still did that, especially for films, but when it came to TV shows, it really invested its money in producing its own shows. And this marked a shift in Netflix just being a distributor of sorts, you know, displaying the content that it hadn't made, to it being both a studio and a distributor. It became more akin to the traditional Hollywood studios. And Netflix were absolutely right to do this, because in the meantime, you have the traditional Hollywood studios demanding their content back. They would allow the licensing deals to lapse, and they would ensure that everyone's favorite shows like Friends and The Office would be available for their own streaming platforms upon launch. And it wasn't long before Netflix and the studios realized that streaming services are like a ravenous, bottomless pit that constantly needs feeding. Streaming services require an intense amount of investment into an intense amount of content in order to keep them viable. And this is a trap that both Netflix and the studios fell into, but because they had invested so much money in producing these platforms, it was really, really hard for them to get out of. That is at least until last year. That is at least until last year, when one CEO by the name of David Zazlav decided to shake up the game. And why did he decide to do so? Well, I suspect that one of the reasons was because in 2022, we saw for the first time in a decade that Netflix reported a substantial decrease in subscribership. Netflix, the Coca-Cola of streaming. Now, whilst there were various reasons for this, the fact that they lost to Russia because of the war, the fact that they lost something in India, the rights to air some sort of sports cricket tournament, something like that, that was also a factor. There were very valid reasons for this decrease in subscribership. It's not the reasons that people tout on Twitter, like, oh, because they keep renewing the shows that I hate and they keep cancelling the shows that I like. That's not necessarily the major reason for why that huge drop happened. But nonetheless, the drop happened, okay? The drop happened, and all of a sudden the studio heads that had invested billions of dollars in this new business model, again introduced to them by this child of Silicon Valley, all of these Burbank boys were like, hang on a minute. All of these Hollywood kids were like, hold up, what's going on? Like, this isn't just a way to make an endless amount of cash after all. Like, there is perhaps a ceiling on this business model. We're gonna need to reconsider this, and reconsider this is exactly what David Zazlav did. Now, some background on David Zazlav will help explain his course of action here, because David Zazlav is, of course, the head of Discovery, and he later became the head of Warner Brothers Discovery after acquiring Warner Media from AT&T a few years back. Now, this acquisition sank Discovery into $50 billion worth of debt. $50 billion, okay? And so it seems like from the second that David Zazlav made that purchase, he regretted it. And he has been talking about cutting costs from pretty much day one. So since this acquisition came about, we have seen hundreds of people lose their jobs, which, to be fair, is something that tends to happen when acquisitions happen. We have also seen how this has impacted certain channels or verticals in the Warner Brothers empire. For instance, the CW slate has become almost non-existent. Like, it is so emaciated at this point, especially because the Arrowverse is wrapping up. A lot of the shows got cancelled. It's just really horrible to see what's become of the CW under David Zaslav. Like, it is horrific. And then we got some reports that the company would not be investing as much money into scripted television anymore, which is of course tied to what's happened to the CW network, but also may even affect juggernauts like HBO, which is just, I mean, HBO is like the crown jewel of Warner Brothers at this point. It's one of the few verticals that has remained consistently brilliant and excellent in quality. So for it to be under that kind of financial strain is very worrying to me, and very worrying to many people in the industry. So Zazlav's purse pinching has not been very popular, as you guys can imagine, okay? He has become a much hated figurehead within the Hollywood establishment. But as bad as that all sounds, it gets worse, because last year he introduced a brand new measure. It was announced that HBO Max would be shedding some of its own original content from its platform. And this is where things just got a bit like, whoa. Like, what do you mean? Like, because it's one thing to get rid of content that was licensed out from another studio. As I discussed, you know, with Netflix, that was how they built their entire library at first. And now we're talking about actual HBO Max originals being removed from HBO Max. And considering what I've just said about how content hungry these streaming services are, and not to mention HBO Max is not even a very old streaming service. They've been fighting to create all of that content. Why is it that all of a sudden the CEO, David Zazlav, would turn around and say, actually, you know, the content that we already have on there, we're actually going to get rid of that? Like, why would they make such a move? And as I alluded to earlier in this video, of course, it has something to do with money. We already know, but I wanted to dive into exactly what's going on here. So the big thing to remember here when it comes to this trend of studios getting rid of their own original content is the word residuals. Is the word residuals, okay? The residuals are payments made to, you know, members of the creative team, actors, directors, showrunners, writers, well after the show has aired. Every single year that the TV series, for instance, is on a particular streaming service, residuals need to be paid to those creatives behind the scenes. And so it does actually cost these streaming services a lot of money to keep this content on their platforms. It's not just the initial cost of creating these series to begin with, but there's also the residual costs that need to be paid to the creatives on an ongoing basis. And so that occurs every single year that the content is on the platform. And so essentially, by removing shows like Love Life and Minx off of HBO Max, Warner Brothers Discovery has actually saved millions of dollars because they don't have to pay the residuals to the cast and crew anymore. And a main target for this measure definitely seems to be the TV shows that weren't as popular and didn't have as much success as perhaps the studio wanted them to, with one exception being Westworld, I would say. Even though Westworld never turned out to be the Game of Thrones that HBO wanted it to be, it was still a very popular series, I'd say. And so it was weird that HBO Max got rid of it until I discovered where it ended up. And that is it was licensed out to another company, I think Tubi or something. An ad-supported streaming service is now licensing out Westworld. So there's still money to be made from these shows that disappear from the streaming platforms. It's just that they have done their calculations and they figured out that actually licensing out this content would give them much more revenue as opposed to keeping it on their platforms where they have to pay residuals to the cast and crew. But then it got a little bit quiet with just, you know, HBO Max being the biggest offender of this new phenomenon, until Disney started to hop on board. Like, literally, it was all fun and games until Disney Plus was like, oh, I see what he's doing and I want in on that. Like, Bob Iger really said, oh, me too. So yeah, Disney decided to go ahead and get rid of a bunch of its own content from Disney Plus also. And again, it's shocking, especially when you have shows like Willow, which literally came out less than a year ago and seems to have been a very expensive production. It's a very bizarre thing for Disney Plus to all of a sudden shed it from its platform. But again, it goes back to these residuals and it goes back to these accountants over at Disney, these highly paid accountants, you know, working overtime, trying to figure out whether it's worthwhile to keep a show like Willow on the platform and have to pay the residuals to the actors and cast and crew and that, versus, you know, shedding it from the platform and getting money out of it in another way, which we'll talk about in a second. But yeah, earlier last week we saw announcements about a whole bunch of content that was set to be removed from Disney Plus, including shows like Turner and Hooch and Willow, Cheaper by the Dozen, The World According to Jeff Goldblum, and also a documentary called Howard. Now this met some uproar on social media because Howard is a documentary about Howard Ashman, who was the lyricist who worked on a lot of the incredible, amazing music from Disney's Renaissance era, including The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, and Aladdin. Of course, as I said earlier, it's Little Mermaid week, so the idea of Disney getting rid of this documentary focused on Howard Ashman, such a key player within the Disney Renaissance era, is just pitiful. Like, it's embarrassing and horrible, especially when you consider that he was a member of the LGBTQ community who unfortunately passed away of AIDS, and this documentary centers on his life, you know, his life's work, but also touches on his private life and his fight with this awful disease at a time when it was so awfully stigmatized. So to get rid of such a valuable documentary is just like sinful, like it's awful. I'm sad to say, but it's only due to this uproar that I even realized this documentary existed, and that's when I checked it out a couple of days ago, and it was just a really beautiful and heartbreaking story, seeing all of his colleagues, like legends like Alan Menken, okay, who was the composer during the Disney Renaissance era, and you know, he was just talking about, you know, working with Howard, especially in the later days as well as his health deteriorated. I mean, it is just a heartbreaking documentary, but I was left in awe of this man's skill and passion and talent. So after this huge backlash, Disney did announce that it would no longer be removing Howard, especially not during Pride Month. These people are so stupid, especially not middays before Pride Month anyway. So yeah, they're not going to be getting rid of Howard anytime soon, but I did see that they're getting rid of, I think, like the behind the scenes of Ryan Coogler and my favorite composer working today, Ludwig Göransson, creating the score for Black Panther Wakanda Forever. So it's things like this that they want to shed the platform of, and honestly that makes me kind of sad, because this is what sets, you know, Disney Plus apart from all of the other platforms that we currently have. And speaking of defining these streaming platforms and allowing them to find their niche, this has been listed as another reason for why these studios have started to shed the streaming platforms of their own original content. Some of these studios are claiming that they want to streamline their streaming services in order to allow them to find their particular niche. They see it as a way to stand out in the marketplace and to be more competitive, as opposed to just mimicking, you know, what the Coca-Cola of streaming has done in Netflix. And one of the major complaints that people often have of Netflix is that it is just this overwhelming library of everything. You know, you can find everything and anything on Netflix, and that leads to sort of indecision fatigue. We've all had that time where we're trying to find something to watch on Netflix and we end up spending a whole hour, the time they would have taken to watch an episode of anything, we end up just scrolling through the whole Netflix library, just feeling like there's nothing to watch because there's everything to watch. So yeah, studios claim that they want to avoid this by streamlining their streaming services, and this does include getting rid of some of the existing programming that they have that doesn't quite align with the vision that they have for their platforms, as well as creating new content that will be in line with this vision. But I call BS on that. Okay, I call BS on that reason, okay? And the reason why is because just last week, Disney announced that it was going to be merging Disney Plus with Hulu in the States. Now, it's already the case internationally. We already have Disney Plus and Star, which essentially has a lot of the Hulu and FX content on there. So we've already experienced this hybrid model and it works really, really well in my opinion. I wouldn't be paying for Disney Plus just based off of the kid stuff that they have on there, and I'm a kid at heart, okay? I love animated films. I love the Disney catalog, okay? The Disney Vault, love it. But I would not be paying for Disney Plus every single month if I just had that, okay? I need the combination of Abbott Elementary and American Horror Story. Maybe I'll watch that someday, who knows? But I like the fact that the option is there. And so I think it's a superior streaming platform with those two things combined. But going back to my point, how does combining Hulu with Disney Plus give you a sense of a more streamlined platform? If anything, you've made it resemble Netflix even more, because Disney Plus, you know, in the States used to basically be a babysitting platform, and now it's a platform where you can get all sorts of things underneath the FX and Hulu and ABC and Disney umbrella. And then let's not forget Warner Brothers Discovery, which started this trend and has recently announced once again their brand new streaming service called Max, which I think is so stupid. To get rid of the part of HBO Max that has the most notoriety is just so befuddling to me. But anyway, they got rid of the HBO and was like, you know, the Max is the selling point here. You were lied to several times, sir. It's the HBO part. Anyways, Warner Brothers Discovery decided to rebrand HBO Max, and now it looks like many of the other streaming services that we have on the market right now. And so that's why I don't understand this reasoning of streamlining streaming services when in actuality they're starting to become even more homogenized than before. Okay, so now that we've dove into the problem at hand, the case of the disappearing streaming shows, it's time to dive into the consequences, like what we can actually expect to happen in the future. How is this going to affect us as audiences, them as the studios, and also the creatives? Let's talk about them for a second as well. But first of all, for us as audiences, this is a bit of a troubling issue, not gonna lie. It's a little bit alarming. It feels like no one is safe. You know, we already knew that licensed content could disappear from our platforms at any second of the day. That was already a given. But the fact that we could even lose the originals is a little bit alarming. It's a little bit disconcerting. Now, those of us who are both Marvel and Netflix fans already experienced this, okay? Because just a couple of years back, we saw the Marvel Netflix shows disappear from the Netflix platform and pop on over to Disney Plus. So like, we know that this is a possibility, but in that case, they were a sort of co-production situation. So it's not like out of the realm of imagination. But in most cases, it would be surprising if all of a sudden you log into Netflix and you no longer see Stranger Things or Orange is the New Black or Squid Game, and it pops up in, I don't know, Roku or something. Do you know what I mean? It's like, what's going on here? I think this actually lends credence to an argument that a lot of old heads, okay? A lot of old heads have been saying for a while now, since the dawn of streaming, and that is that owning physical media is far superior to streaming, because with physical media like DVDs and VHSs, Blu-rays, I can't even remember what they were, okay? But with physical media, you actually own a copy of that thing. Whereas with streaming, we never really owned anything. We only had the right to access the streaming platform through our subscriptions, but we weren't actually paying for each individual unit of that content the way that we would purchase like a box set of a season of Vampire Diaries or something. And so there are definitely cons to this, as we're starting to see when these studios are able to make decisions like this that will inevitably impact their viewers. But there were also cons to physical media as well. Let's not forget that either, okay? It took up a lot of space. It was a waste of plastic. And also sometimes it would break or the machine would stop working. Like there were all these issues that could come up with physical media. So there's no real perfect alternative to streaming. I still prefer streaming, hands down. But I would say that if there is, you know, a show that you really, really love, something that you really see yourself going back to time and time again, perhaps purchase the physical copy if you can, because these days nothing is safe. Now let's turn to how this is going to affect the studios. Now we've already started to see this effect, and I think once again it was spearheaded by David Zazlav, who came right out of the gate kind of turning his nose at the direction that Hollywood was going in, that being, you know, following in Netflix's footsteps. He comes from a very traditional entertainment background with reality TV shows and, you know, airing stuff on television, whatever that means. And he was just ruling over Discovery. That was his domain. That was the area that he was most comfortable in traditional media. And so he sought to steer Warner Brothers Discovery in that direction as well. And we were all laughing at him last year. We were all laughing at him when he was like, oh yeah, I want to, you know, reintroduce ads and license stuff again and get rid of scripted content. We were like, you fool. You idiot. But now look who's laughing. It ain't us, okay? Because Disney, like I said, is following in these very similar footsteps. They're not just getting rid of their existing original content, but in some cases experimenting how they distribute this content as well. Like in the case of Andor last year, where they experimented with airing a couple of episodes on ABC, a TV network. I'm joking, I don't care. A TV network in order to get some ad revenue. And so perhaps this is going to affect how they construct or produce the episodes of upcoming TV shows meant for Disney Plus. Perhaps they will allow for ad breaks in these episodes so that they can monetize these shows in other ways, like airing them on their TV networks. And another tactic that Bob Iger recently talked about in an earnings call was producing less content overall. We've definitely seen a shift from trying to satiate this unsatiable, you know, content hungry monster that is these streaming services to trying to maximize profits and absolutely minimize costs, which is a tactic that I think was spearheaded by Zazlav because of that $50 billion debt that he is saddled with. And I personally am in favor of having fewer shows be released every year on Disney Plus. I think the vast majority of their releases have been ignored by the general public. The most eyes seem to be on the IP shows, like, you know, the Marvel shows and the Star Wars shows. But even then, you know, with a few missteps, people tend to lose interest quite quickly. So it's a very delicate situation that I need to navigate, but I do think that slowing down and focusing on quality over quantity should help with this. But the only way that releasing fewer shows is actually going to work is if studios squeeze out the revenue that they can get from each show that they're releasing. And I think one way they can do that is by advertising these shows better. These streaming platforms do not advertise. They do not advertise anything. Remember when I said that I'd never even heard of this Howard documentary? Yeah, it was never advertised, okay? They'll just have like a random list come out every week of the stuff that they're going to be releasing, and that's that. The only time that they try to advertise is when, like I said, it's an IP series like, you know, Star Wars or a Marvel. That's when they'll pump some money into advertising, but otherwise they refuse to do so. And I think if you are going to be producing fewer shows every year, the least you can do is take some of the money that you're going to save and push it into advertising, especially if your quality over quantity strategy actually works, and these shows are really good and worth watching on your platform. At least invest a little bit more money into advertising them. And the second strategy is something that we have already been seeing for a couple of years now, and that is the rejection of the binge model. This ties into a video that I did last year talking about the different release strategies in streaming that we see for various TV shows. And we have seen in the last few years that whilst these newer streaming services may have taken a couple of pages from Netflix's book, there are a few things that they have changed, including their release strategies. A lot of them have rejected the binge model entirely and gone for either the hybrid model of posting a few episodes on the first day of release and then going on with a weekly release, or they've just gone entirely weekly with just one episode a week being posted on the platform. And this is yet another way that you can maximize the revenue of each show that you're making, because if a series is 8 episodes long, instead of posting it all in one day, you can stretch it out to a whole 8 weeks, and that means 2 months of subscriptions at least that you're getting from your audience. Now that we've talked about the effects that this phenomenon can have on the audience and the studios, the last group of people I wanted to touch on was, of course, the creatives, the writers, the producers and showrunners that are now losing out on a ton of residual revenue. And this is an effect that we have already seen manifested in the last few weeks with the WGA's writer's strike. Now, I'm going to be diving into the writer's strike in a future video, but just a heads up, it's not a great situation, and most of the demands for the WGA are rooted in the lack or decrease in revenue that writers have experienced under this new business model that is so focused on streaming. But that's it from me, guys. Now that I talked about the curious case of the disappearing streaming shows, it's time for you guys to let me know what you think of this phenomenon, this trend in Hollywood, down in the comments below. Please be sure to subscribe to catch new videos coming up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.